Welcome to From Loci to Global YouTube channel. My name is Fatih. I'm an independent journalist in Austria. I'm going to create YouTube videos about European and global politics. My ultimate goal in these YouTube contents is to bring your stories and perspective inside all political issues and discussions. Therefore, I would really welcome if you just make comments and give certain feedbacks about each content. Today we are going to talk about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It is still a very controversial question to ask, why did Russia invade Ukraine? The question gained its own popularity through an article published by famous American political scientist John Mearsheimer. The article title is "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault" drew enormous attention all over the world. He says US and European allies are mainly to be blamed for Russian decision to invade Ukraine. In this video, we are going to make a reflection to Mearsheimer's article. According to Mearsheimer, the main reason behind Russian decision to invade Ukraine is NATO enlargement and EU membership process which tries to include Ukraine as a full member of the Union. So one can ask, how come EU and NATO enlargement process can be sole cause of Russian invasion of an independent and sovereign state? Basically, he believes that EU's irreversible improving economic and political ties with Ukraine and open gate policy towards Ukraine from NATO led Russia to invade Ukraine. This explanation to Ukraine does not reflect all the truth inside. So in this video we are going to make a counter-reflection to Mearsheimer's article. Unlike most of the political leaders, President Putin wrote an article about the Ukraine and Ukrainians 5 months later after Russia decided to invade Ukraine. He starts saying that the war between Russian and Ukrainians occurred first and foremost because of Russian own mistakes. After saying this, he keeps blaming the Western allies to implement rule and device strategy. So we are going to talk more about what he means by Russian own mistakes to Ukraine. But in this essay, he underlines that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians are all descendants of ancient Rus, which was largest state in Europe. He believes that these three people are bound by together one language, economic ties, and Orthodox faith. All these historic ancient references makes him believe that these three nations are belonging to one single nation. In the essay, he makes references to economic cooperation developed by Ukraine and Russia by saying that economic system over centuries and profound cooperation we had 30 years ago, what EU should look up. As you see, there is a certain competition between EU's economic enlargement to Ukraine and Russian existence economic ties with Ukraine. The most important part of President Putin article is about the Ukrainian sovereignty. He says, we respect the Ukrainian language and traditions. We respect Ukraine's desire to see their country free, safe, and prosperous. But he says, I am confident that true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible only with partnership with Russia. Here, President Putin underlines that any sort of cooperation with West and Western institutions would damage and limit exercise of Ukrainian sovereignty. Even though Mearsheimer just focus on the West encouraging Ukraine to be part of Western family, there is also local dynamic, as you see that Ukrainian peoples just wants to see their country into Western family. So Even in Putin essay, we see this local dynamic that Ukraine sees its economic and political future in the West. But he reminds us, President Putin reminds us that it's also up to Ukraine to decide which side they should choose, but any attempt to choose to cooperate with West would restrain its sovereignty, which is a clear warning to Ukrainian people. As we mentioned in the essay, he refers to deteriorating relations with West and he blames Russians' mistakes. Why did he just shut his country first when making and preparing article about the invasion of Ukraine? After the end of the Cold War, Ukraine by herself put great emphasis on sovereignty and inviolability of territorial integrity by signing bilateral and multilateral international agreements. So, throughout all 1990s, what we see is a clear Ukrainians' will to make their countries independent and sovereign on the eyes of Russians. In 1994, Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, guaranteed and recognized by Russia, United States and the United Kingdom. This is one of the most important multilateral international agreement to protect Ukraine's sovereignty. But after this agreement in 1997, big treaty signed between Ukraine and Russian Federation. The treaty again underlines the recognition of the inviolability of existing borders and respect for territorial integrity and mutual commitment to not harm each other. So these treaty also prevent the parties, Ukraine and Russia, not attacking, invading and changing existing territories. However, in terms of economic relations with Russia, Putin is right to say that there is a deep economic ties between these two countries. Ukraine industry was dependent predominantly on subsidized Russian gas. However, again, this essay reminds us that Ukraine's sovereignty is conditional on the eyes of Russia. As long as she wants to become a member of the Western institutions or cooperate with Western institutions, her sovereignty would be restrained. This is a clear message that Russia tries to give in this essay. But we should keep in mind that Mearsheimer's article just focusing on the Western's eagerness to include Ukraine into Western security structure. But in reality, Russia accepted the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine on paper. But you see, there is something going differently on Russian domestic politics, which see any cooperation in Ukrainian cooperation with the West somehow antagonized by Russia. Let's look into Ukraine's relations with NATO. Ukraine joined the North Atlantic Cooperation Council in 1991 and the Partnership for Peace Program in 1994. As you can see, after the exact moment of Ukrainian independence, Ukrainian political elites wanted to make a cooperation with NATO. As a result of this cooperation, the action plan has been prepared. According to the action plan, this action plan is to identify Ukraine's strategic objectives and political priorities in pursuit of its inspiration towards full integration into Euro-Atlantic security structures and provide a strategic framework for existing NATO-Ukrainian relations. But as you can see, NATO and Ukrainians' security ties and relations was not a secret plan, but published publicly, and seemingly Russia accepted the strengthening relations with NATO throughout all 1990s, in line with its commitments to bilateral and international agreement. The most striking event happened when President Putin made a press conference with Ukrainian President Kuchma. He was asked by one of the reporters this whether Russia would be a member of the NATO or not, and what he thinks about the strengthening relations between NATO and Ukraine. And he basically clearly said that Russia will not become a member of the NATO in the future, but he is convinced that Ukraine and NATO will improve its relations in the future, and it's up to Ukraine to decide whether they will strengthen its relations with NATO or not. As you can see from here, what Mearsheimer tells us about the Russian invasion of Ukraine is quite contradictory what Putin stated in this press conference. Do you think it might be a political gaffe? Please make a comment on, please put some comments in the chat. In 2008 Bucharest summit, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia will join the US-led defense alliance. This is the first time officially NATO expressed its willingness to Ukraine as a full member of the alliance. As Mearsheimer expressed in the article, this decision to include Ukraine into NATO was a direct threat to Russia from President Putin's eyes. What they believe that this NATO membership process towards Ukraine frustrated and led Russia to invade Ukraine. However, in the exact moments of Ukrainian independence, as we mentioned, she expressed her interest towards NATO and Western security structure in a stated in partnership for peace programs. In 2002, he was underlining it's up to Ukraine to strengthen its relations with NATO or not. He basically underlining to Ukrainian sovereignty in 2002 press conference. And also here, it's also important to notice that during the Bucharest summit, France and Germany were quite critical of Ukraine's NATO membership, and they blocked that any membership negotiation with Ukraine. From 2010 to 2014, Ukraine pursued non-alignment policy which terminated relations with NATO as a result of Russian aggression. In 2019, NATO membership as a strategic foreign and policy objectives made through constitutional change. You see that Ukraine somehow from the 2010 to 2014, Ukraine just withdraw from the NATO's good relations with NATO, and then come back to good terms with NATO. But as we will mention, it is related to strengthening relations with EU. Let's look into Ukraine relations with EU. Partnership and Cooperation Agreement entered force in 1998. This document identified the EU and Ukraine relations without any goal of membership. The Orange Revolution in late 24 improved relations significantly. After the Orange Revolution, the newly established government committed to a joint EU-Ukraine action plan, which was endorsed by the European Commission in 2005. This action plan based upon the previous partnership and cooperation agreement and provided ambitious framework for joint of work with Ukraine in all key areas of reforms. After this ambitious plan, talks on free trade agreement between Ukraine and the European Union started in 2008, and a new instrument was adopted, EU and Ukrainian Association Agenda, including Ukraine into EU common market. It is very important to keep in mind here that EU was very cautious and slow in forging relations with Ukraine. Always remind Ukraine to adopt more EU regulations. But from the Mearsheimer and the President Putin views that EU just was playing just geopolitical game in line with NATO enlargement process. But At EU case, it was not true because EU was always emphasizing upon the democratic regulation in domestic politics in Ukraine. For example, in 2008, European Commission President Jose Manuel stated that our Ukrainian friends needs to do more if they want us to help them more. And also he stated that enlargement is not possible in the current situation. In line with this cautious approach from the European side, the EU Association Agreement was initiated in 2012. However, Germany pressuring Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych and his Azorov government to halt detention of the Tymoshenko in fear of her degrading health. So, as you see in this example, there was a willingness to include Ukraine into the European Union. Germany pressuring Ukraine to implement more democratic policies in Ukrainian domestic politics. Due to Tymoshenko detention, rule of law and democracy break in Ukraine led to the boycott of UEFA Euro 2012 and delaying ratification of the deep and comprehensive trade agreement with Ukraine. As you see, there is no geopolitical game, at least within the EU, that they can include Ukraine whatever undemocratic reforms going on in the Ukraine at that time. In 2014, the Ukrainian President Yanukovych rejected to ratify the EU Association Agreement ratification, led to huge protests in Kiev, and these protests were called Euromaidan protests. In reaction to protests, Russia invaded Crimea and started war in Donbas region. Afterwards, Petro Poroshenko, new elected president, signed economic part of the association agreement. This is the end of the video. I just tried to give a reflection to match my articles with just focusing on the Western mistakes, just sole reason behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But the reality itself is quite complex. He is right that NATO enlargement and the rise of the EU's relation with Ukraine somehow frustrated Russia to invade the Ukraine. But the reality is quite complicated then. Throughout all 1990s, we see Russia accepted the sole sovereignty of Ukraine and inviolability of the territorial independence. In 2002 press conference, Putin clearly said that it's up to Ukraine to decide its future. Ukraine relations with NATO started exact beginning of this independence, and throughout all 1990s, Russia just kept blind eye on strengthening relations with NATO. 2008 Bucharest summit referred very much by the Mearsheimer's article. It didn't come out of spontaneously. There was a history that the Ukraine and the NATO were trying to strengthen its relations, but somehow fearing that Russia would deteriorate these relations. But throughout all 1990s, as Putin called these mistakes, accepted Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This is the end of my video. I would be really grateful if you just put your views, perspectives, or your ideas about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and how do you see the Mearsheimer articles and my reflection. Please feel free to add your views in the comments. Thank you.